Thank you for joining our panel discussion on What Now? Facing the legal, human, and sales impact on your business. I'd like to begin the discussion with a quote that was submitted by one of our registrants. I thought it was especially apropos. On the other side of the storm is the strength that comes from having navigated through it. Raise your sail and begin. So there's no time like the present, and that's what this is all about. What we're going to talk about today, welcome to Zoom. For those of you that haven't used it much, hopefully this is an opportunity to experiment a little bit and get a little familiar with it. It's a wonderful tool. Watch the chat box. If you don't see a chat box, go to the top of your screen, usually right in the middle, and you'll have a drop-down box that will give you some view options. You'll want to look at the chat box on that. We're going to allow about 10 to 15 minutes per panelist, and they're going to go through what they've been seeing on various topics, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So what now? The questions that we received in advance, we're hearing a lot of questions about, what do we do? We've got general concerns about the budgets. Where do we find clients that are actually going to have some money to pay us? What do we do with the people we have to keep paying? And what's it going to look like? Because eventually we are going to return to normal. So a lot of those questions that we're going to go through. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maritza Nelson. She's a lawyer with Law Office of Maritza Nelson, and if you've read her bio, she's got a fabulous experience in a variety of work with small businesses of all kinds. So Maritza, you're on.
All right, well, thank you so much for that, Karen. Welcome everyone. I don't know whose bright idea was to let the lawyer, the doom and gloom sayer come in and talk first, but what's all the doom and gloom that we're hearing about in the legal world? I'll start first of all with kind of court cases, legal actions, all of those types of things that we're seeing going on right now. So what we're seeing at the moment, some of you may have heard Governor DeWine signed HB 197 just this past Friday. And the big topic, of course, was pushing out the tax filing deadlines, dealing with absentee voting, those types of issues. But in the legal world, that legislation also told what we call the statute of limitations. So what does that mean? Effectively, the governor's latest legislation put a pause on the deadline for filing new court cases. And that applies in the criminal world, the civil world, all of those things. So it doesn't mean that the courts are closed. Obviously, there are some important things that they still have a pause on for when you need to file any new litigation. And that's going to take place over this period from March 9th to July 30th. It could potentially end sooner if the emergency declaration ends sooner, but right now we're not counting on that. The other important thing about this is that to the extent that you were already involved in any litigation, I talked to a lot of small businesses who, breach of contract cases are extremely common, fights between business partners, those types of things. The court deadlines are also basically put on pause at the moment. So unless your particular court, your judge issues an order otherwise, what the Supreme Court of Ohio just emailed us and told us this morning was that they're effectively pausing those deadlines as well. So say, for example, you were already involved in a case and you had an answer due with the court, say March 19th. Effectively, because of this order and the legislation that was just signed, that's now been put on hold, probably until sometime in August. So if you're involved in litigation, you've been threatened with litigation, the big thing to keep in mind on that front is talk to your attorney, make sure you're seeking counsel. Don't just assume that you're getting off scot-free at the moment, because all this stuff is going to come back around at some point when the world starts to clear up. But stay in constant contact, figure out what those new deadlines are going to be so that you don't miss anything. Even though the legislation technically puts a lot of things on pause right now, we're still being told, if at all possible, still file your cases, still meet the deadlines. especially in those counties like Franklin County where we do have electronic filing. We don't have to physically go to the courthouse to make these things happen. So if you're in litigation or even considering litigation for any reason, don't just assume that everything is completely stopped, okay? This stuff will come back at some point, but you gotta stay informed. You gotta stay in constant communication with your attorney because this information is changing literally by the hour. I start with all that to say, the other big question that I'm getting is, so what happens to contracts in the middle of this pandemic? If the courts are telling people, hey, you've got extra time to file cases, does that mean that I don't have to worry about a breach of contract? Does that mean that my landlord can't sue me for not paying the rent? And the answer to that is largely no. Things might be on pause at the moment, but all of these things are going to circle back around. Right now, I don't anticipate there being a lot of litigation activity, but cases will absolutely resume, okay? I might be the jaded attorney or the negative Nancy, but when things circle back around, when the economy starts to unthaw, I can guarantee you that your vendors, business partners, landlords, disgruntled former employees, angry customers, all of those types that were litigation happy before this pandemic are probably going to be litigation happy afterwards. So you really want to figure out, how do you protect your business and abide by your contracts to the extent that you can? So when we talk about, how long does somebody have to file a lawsuit for breach of contract in Ohio, that could be anywhere from 6 to 8 years. So even if we're stuck in this for the next 12 to 18 months, these things are going to come back around to bite us at some point. The big topic in contracts that we're all discussing right now, somewhere buried in most of your contracts, usually in the miscellaneous section with all of the legalese, is this concept called force majeure. And that's the clause that typically says something like, if there's an act of God or a war breaks out or terrorism, then perhaps the parties don't have to continue to follow or abide by the contract. Those clauses are drafted differently almost every time. I think every attorney writes them differently. And so how that's going to be interpreted in your case is going to depend on what exactly that clause says. But the idea is that if something comes up that's completely outside of the party's control, then we're going to either renegotiate the terms, or that will excuse performance, or that will give us some additional time to work through it. If you ever look at one of those contracts and you're trying to figure out, okay, do I have to perform under this contract during the middle of this pandemic? I think the key phrase you're probably looking for in there, because most of your contracts won't mention a pandemic specifically, will be a reference to government laws, orders, or regulations. So for example, a lot of businesses are shut down right now because of orders from the governor. So that type of language should excuse performance under a contract. But what we're anticipating is that there will be a great deal of litigation around these issues, particularly as things start to clear up. We're already hearing arguments from other attorneys that, sure, these types of clauses might protect you from not performing, but they're not going to protect you from, say, spending money or from the obligation to pay money. So that's going to be especially important as we're talking about commercial leases, and some of you are trying to deal with your landlords. We're also seeing attorneys already make the argument that these types of clauses only apply to situations that were unforeseeable. When did COVID-19 become unforeseeable? We had news reports of it in China at the beginning of the year and going back to the end of last year. So already we're seeing attorneys start to think through some of the arguments that they can make to try to protect their clients' best interests and say, oh, no, you knew that this was going to be a problem. You should still pay us. You still owe us this money. The other thing you'll want to look at in your contracts as you're trying to figure out what you can and can't do right now is be very careful to look for any notice provisions or languages around giving notice to the other party. Oftentimes the contract will say how you have to do that, when you have to do that. So to the extent that you can, you definitely want to be abiding by those provisions. If it says you have to give your landlord notice within X number of days of something happening, you want to make sure you're aware of that and that you're doing it and that you're sending that notice the right way. Sometimes the contract will. Now, as arguments that I expect people will be making, especially as we start to head out of this, but as a practical matter, we suspect that landlords and lenders generally are probably going to be working with people to restructure payments. We've already started to see some of that happen. Historically, we saw it happen just after 9/11. So even if you're not sure how your particular contract should be applied, I always tell people, there's the textbook answer and there's the real world answer. In the real world, this is new territory for all of us. They didn't cover this in law school. So you want to reach out to those landlords, you want to reach out to those lenders, and you want to start to work with them. You want to present to them a reasonable plan. Okay, the entire world is falling is not a reasonable plan for I'm going to be able to pay you back later. You'll want to look at things like, you know, what's your cash flow? What's your cash position? Can you get any of the relief funding that is starting to come through? You know, how are you planning to pay this back? If you're a retail business, how are you planning to get access to inventory and get maybe switched over to online shopping or online services? So make sure you've got those questions answered and don't just approach the landlord for a handout. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where, you know what, God forbid it ever happens, but some of these things that are going on could potentially lead to litigation. The other thing to be aware of is to make sure that you're preserving information and preserving evidence. There's nothing that we as attorneys hate more than a bunch of he said, she said. And especially right now with everyone working from home, there's really no excuse not to have conversations and documented in emails and letters. One of the big areas that we're all concerned about as attorneys right now is that as a lot of meetings are taking place over Zoom and Skype and these types of platforms, you know, are you able to preserve those communications? What does that look like if you're recording conversations? Zoom does a great job of letting you know that that's happening automatically. But what efforts are you taking to make sure that those conversations with your landlord or your lenders are being documented so that you don't get into a he said, she said later? And then lastly, and I know Sharon will probably touch on this in a great bit more detail, but the other question I'm getting a lot from clients is what about working from home? To the extent possible, obviously you want to allow it. I know a lot of people aren't in a position to keep their employees or keep them busy enough to work from home, but to the extent that that's feasible for your business, you certainly want to start looking at how do you put that plan into place? What does that look like? I think it's certainly preferable to have a policy or even a work from home agreement in place because there are some questions and issues that you're going to want to deal with. For example, if you're providing new equipment to your staff during this crazy time, how is that equipment going to get returned? What happens if that equipment is lost or stolen or damaged in some way? We're seeing a lot already about how are we going to deal with expense reimbursements during this crazy time. You know, that's an area that is rife for fraud, even in the best of days. So how do you make sure that what your employees are submitting for expense reimbursements are areas that are actually business expenses and that they're actually using for the business? Making sure that you're keeping track of hours and breaks, particularly for your hourly employees. It's very easy for somebody to come along later and say that they weren't paid their full wages for all the hours that they worked or that we can all deal with chiefs to make sure that those claims don't come up. And remembering that as the employer, you've got the burden to keep those records. We've also seen guidance from the Bureau of Workers' Comp about dealing with workers' comp for employees who are working from home. So, you know, you can always go to the BWC website to look for some of that information. We're not as concerned about your employee that takes a break and goes and walks their dog. But, you know, if your employee is dealing with heavier equipment, you know, trips and falls while setting up the computer for the new home office, you know, those types of things could potentially lead to workers' comp claims. And lastly, the other area that we're keeping a very close eye on is cybersecurity. It was a huge issue even before all of this happened. I know everybody only hears about it in the news when we're talking about big businesses, but the truth is we know that it happens to smaller businesses more. It just doesn't make the cover of the Washington Post. And so we know that attackers are exploiting this time. They're playing on people's fears. They're going to be playing on your fears and the fears of your employees. So those phishing attacks where you get the crazy emails that, you know, look very legitimate and offer business opportunities that are too good to be true, that are designed to get your personal information. We know that more and more of those are going out right now. We're seeing the same thing with websites that are spoofing government sites or trying to spoof your health insurance company's website or even your doctor's website, again, in an attempt to get your personal information or to get personal information from your staff. Particularly with all the Zoom and video conferencing going on, we're already seeing concerns with employees maybe potentially sharing confidential information with someone that they shouldn't. So if you have any business confidential information or client information that you're supposed to be protecting, again, making sure that's covered in your work from home policies to make sure your employees know who they're talking to and who they're sharing information with. So keeping your employees educated about the risk. And then lastly, we've even heard reports just this week of individuals using random number generators to crash Zoom meetings. to display rather unwanted images with the video sharing function. So there's a lot of stuff to be aware of. Again, I know as the attorney, I always get to be the doom and gloom person, but the biggest thing right now, stay informed, put a plan together, and make sure that you are communicating with your key partners. Karen?
Wow. Yeah, let's, this is a good time to say I am recording this, this webinar, because I think some of that stuff we're gonna wanna go, that was a lot to digest, but thanks. That's some really good information. With that, I'm gonna move it on to Sharon Delay with Go HR. And Sharon, tell us how the HR world is dealing with this.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Seems to, yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, so it's been a busy couple of weeks for us, and Maritza, for everything I have been talking to clients about, just managed to bring me down. So thanks, Maritza. Anyways, let's go through some of let's go through some of the hot topics that I am working with on several of our employers, and even, you know, not our clients, but people who just need some information. So some of the big things, I'm going to touch on something that Maritza brought up real quick before I hop into my presentation. The work from home agreement. What we're finding is this is absolutely critical. We have examples that we have walked several of our clients through. They tend to be very resistant, and I'm sure Maritza can confirm this, because they feel like it is impacting their culture in a way that they don't typically work. They feel like it's very restrictive, but if you think about it, it's an extension of your handbook. And in your handbook, you let people know about their privacy issues or lack of privacy to expect in the office. The work from home agreement is simply an extension of that. So I would encourage you to look at one of those agreements, because the reality is we have just proven that a lot of people can work from home. So once things are back to our new normal, that's going to become a constant request from your employees now. And you're going to have to figure out what battles you want to fight and how you want to approach that discussion going forward. And to tag on to something else that Maritza said is, we find that it really helps maybe set expectations for employees who work from home when they understand that if they do have an accident in their home and claim it as workers' comp, they are essentially inviting all of us to walk in and conduct an investigation. That will frequently also curb your employees' activities at those 2 points. All right, so let's talk about the 5 hot areas that we've been dealing with our clients for the last couple of weeks. And the first one is, you all know this very, very well, which is the FFCRA, which stands for Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That was the first big act that was signed into effect really for most employers to deal with. And the big things out of that we're working with employers on is the emergency paid sick leave, which is new for a lot of small employers, and the expanded FMLA. Here's the thing. A lot of employees are feeling like this is a paid 3-month vacation, essentially. And a lot of employers are feeling like they are indebted to pay a 3-month vacation. But if you really look at the criteria of these 2 leaves, they are very, very narrow in terms of how employees qualify. And if you have employees successfully working from home right now, also noted in the acts as teleworking, you're probably not going to have to pay out on these 2 acts. So my initial advice when a client calls us is just calm down. Let's talk about your unique situation, and let's really work through it, because I think you will find that you do have options outside of these, and that the criteria to qualify for these particular leaves is actually very narrow. once we go through those discussions, a lot of people actually feel a lot better. If you are a company as well that has over 50 employees and you have to follow what we're now calling either traditional FMLA or there have been a couple of other terms used, but really what's been FMLA for several years in place now. If you have employees who've already used some of their FMLA leave this year, then, or in the 12-month period that you have defined, then that does also cut down on their FMLA use for the expanded act. So you really do have a lot of protection in place for you on how this can be used and potentially abused. So my best advice for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act is calm down, and then let's talk through it patiently. The next big thing that came out that everybody is frantically doing right now is what's called the CARES Act, and that was just signed into place last week. And I know if there are bankers on here, I know all the employers on here, you've probably been talking to your banks about getting, finding out what loan's best for you, finding out what opportunities you have. Your banks have been working frantically with the SBA to get all of the language, but there are essentially three big pieces from the CARES Act. We're going to talk about the big one that really relates to a lot of you last, but the other ones are the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, which you'll also hear referred to as EIDL, and the SBA Traditional 7A loans. I'm not a banker, I'm not a finance person, I'm not an accountant. My best advice to you is, because we're getting a lot of these questions of what should people apply for. My best advice to you is to work with your finance people and to work with your accountants to project out what you're looking at in various percentages of revenue. If I do 20% revenue, if I do 50% revenue, if I do 80% revenue, if I do 100% revenue, what does that look like for me? And that will help you determine what to tap into. Work with those partners and those people who do that better. For the Paycheck Protection Loan, it's called the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. I can't say that very often. You should look into that. You should contact your banker immediately, get the paperwork in effective tomorrow, because that's when they can start loaning on this. And you can essentially get 2.5 times your monthly average payroll, up to $10 million. And if you keep people employed for 8 weeks after that loan has been originated, you can get loan forgiveness. So there are some criteria to follow. But I will tell you what you can do here. A lot of you are like, I can't even do business if I keep people on the payroll. What's the purpose? Here's the purpose. A lot of times as employers, we put off critical employee development, critical upskilling, and critical training to get our team in the best position possible to be the best vendor, service provider, consultant, whatever that is for our clients. This is a gift if you think about it. Get that protection, paycheck protection loan, get it in your hands, and use the next 8 weeks when you aren't servicing clients in other ways, because we still hope you're doing some billable work, but use that excess time to upskill your workforce, to do the critical trainings like sexual harassment, reasonable suspicion training for your managers and supervisors. Use this time as a gift, if you can find the positive in it, to have your employees go through training on somebody else's dime, so to speak, although ultimately we will all be paying for all of this if we're really honest. But those are a couple of things to be thinking about with these two acts. Number one, calm down, because a lot of times some of this might not apply to you. And number two, take advantage of everything you can, but work with your key business advisors to find out what's the best strategy and combination. Okay, let's talk about unemployment. So numbers came out today, and we had this week another 6.6 million US workers apply for unemployment. That's on top of the 3.3 that were reported last week. That's a lot of people who are unemployed. So again, if you can bring people back on payroll, that's great. if you're in Ohio, which I think everybody on here is in Ohio, you are all probably aware of the Ohio Job and Family Services mass layoff form. If not, please reach out to me. I will shoot the form over to you. It has a special number on it that if you have to lay off your workforce, you can provide this document to them. They can file for unemployment, and then that filing will go into what's called the Mutualized Unemployment Fund with the state of Ohio. What that essentially means is those claims will go not against your individual account, but into this mutualized fund. So your individual rate, if you laid off 13 people, I have a client that had to lay off their entire workforce, they will not have 13 claims of unemployment against their insurance account. It goes into this mutualized fund. Again, we all ultimately will pay for all of this, but better to raise the C level for everyone than hit one person dead on. So make sure that you use that particular form if you have to lay off your workforce. Do not use this time, however, to bury a bad performer into a mass layoff. You don't want to get caught up in doing fraudulent claims or having employees do fraudulent claims either, because if that stuff does eventually track down, that's going to cost you, and that's going to potentially impact the employee negatively as well. You want to make every decision when it comes to laying off your workforce strategically and defensively. So Maritza had noticed or had indicated documenting everything that you do. That holds true here well. So if you make decisions to lay off a portion of your workforce, it needs to be defensible in case you ever have to defend yourself. And by that, I mean, don't look at laying off just the 50-year-olds. Don't look at just laying off a certain ethnic population. You want to look at laying off in a defensible manner. We're going to lay off everybody who was the last ones that we hired up to this date, as an example. It may be that you lay off everybody that you have documented performance improvement plans on. But look at whatever you do and make it a defensible decision for the right reasons. And then you will feel better. And then we talk about bringing those people back in. You also have a reverse engineering process to start bringing people back into your company when things do improve and when we start moving back in the right direction. So those were some of the key things I really wanted to bring up to talk about. Happy to answer questions, Karen, when you open it up, but that's the bulk of what I wanted to make sure we covered.
Wow, there's a lot of nuggets in there as well. One of the things that I'm pulling out of this, and a key takeaway I'm hearing, especially from you, Sharon, is that we've got options, and stay calm, and that's really hard to do, but to think through it and reach out, and that actually segues into some of the things that I wanted to talk about. Which also helps to explain why I put the lawyer first and the marketer or last, because we're kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. But I'm Karen Sullivan. My company is Sullivan Solutions, and we're seeing a lot of our clients, just like a lot of you on the call, a lot of our clients are just hunkered down and really trying to figure out how to get through the next day, let alone what's going to come after this. And so stop, take a deep breath. That's very good feedback for all of us. A lot of what I'm hearing, it's basically a strategy to buy time. Don't panic fast. Don't make rash decisions fast. And that has to do with your financial pieces, that has to do with your people piece, and with your market pieces. It's hard because a lot of us have had to shut down completely. But very, very quickly, human ingenuity comes to the forefront, and we find ways to market ourselves a little differently. We find a little bit different way to connect with our customers. And in some cases, we find new customers. So that's what I kind of wanted to talk about in defining your new box. Just like a lot of the restaurants are having to deal with some delivery issues, we've got a retailer that fortunately is staying open. They're an essential business, but we don't know day to day what's going to happen on that. So putting some of those things online and creating some of those delivery options, those things don't have to be perfect, but they can be quickly implemented. Things like, we threw up a website literally in 30 hours to allow online shopping. Am I going to submit it for a design award? No way. But it's functional, and that's a little bit of a way to buy time and to think outside the box of normal everyday operations. One of the reasons I wanted to push to do this Zoom seminar today, that's another way of staying in touch, having conversations, getting comfortable with talking online. We're hearing a lot of our customers are actually willing to talk. Everybody wants to vent a little bit. Everybody wants to find out what somebody else is doing. It's incredibly helpful to hear from Maritza and Sharon what their customers are saying. One of my clients called yesterday, honestly calling to see what he can do about his contract and how we're going to move forward and how he's going to pay me. And in giving him good advice, he's spent the last 2 days calling all of his vendors, having these conversations, trying to fill out the forms. He's absolutely overwhelmed. If he were allowed to work, he wouldn't be able to, simply because of all the impact. But what's coming out of that is virtually everyone that we've talked to is willing to make this work. I've talked to large commercial developers, landlords, my landlord, but talking in a broader sense, they're very willing to work with especially the smaller businesses to help them find ways to work through this. I spent a fair amount of time on the phone yesterday with the Chamber of Commerce here in Dublin, and they're doing a lot of coordination. They're hearing very definitely that the banks are really working to find ways to make this work for people. So pick up the phone, talk to your banker. I know we heard that from Sharon and Maritza, but those conversations need to be had. And I will give a shout out to the Chambers of Commerce. Incidentally, they're kind of on the front line, and they're doing a great job of putting some resources together. So I've seen both the Dublin and the Westerville chambers really putting some great information out. However, as the type of nonprofit that they are, they're actually not eligible for any of these aid packages. So they're getting stretched really thin in trying to provide the services that they need to provide. Just kind of keep that in mind, show them some love. But they're doing a really good job of it. They're taking their programming online. So having those conversations and working through those, get to know Zoom. There's Skype, there's FaceTime, there's several alternatives, but you can still have that face-to-face conversation. You can meet for lunch, you can meet for networking, you can meet for wine, whatever it takes. It's a really great way to keep those conversations going. One of the things that's a little bit outside of the box that we're doing, Maritza mentioned the issues of documenting conversations. That's something a lot of times you don't have to worry about when you have your employees working on site. The minute you send them home and let them communicate over a chat message or by email, suddenly they're burdened by being overwhelmed, but you've now lost control of all that information. And even if it isn't going to impact your company from a legal perspective, you do have the opportunity for losing control of your intellectual property. Those things, especially in a service business, that make you who you are and create that differentiator for you. If you don't put these best practices in place and work with your employees to manage that, you lose control of that as an employer, as a business owner. So it's sort of the underbelly of the branding issue. You know, we always want these communications to be branded, of course, but you don't want to lose control of them either. You don't want those happening outside your cyber walls, even though they're happening outside your brick and mortar walls. So a few of those things to help do that, as Sharon mentioned, and I think this is great food for thought. We all say we never have enough time to work on our business, and I'm guilty as anybody. Right now is a fabulous time to work on your business and learn some of these new skills. Learn Zoom, learn some of the communication tools. Virtually all of these tools are offering either free or discounted, heavily discounted, like 50% or more discounted services. So if price has been an excuse in the past, it doesn't need to be right now. And they're waiving a lot of the subscription timeframes. So it's really overwhelming. Zoom is offering, I think, definitely check it out. I don't want to give misinformation here, but Zoom is making it easy for everyone to, at the very least, have a free conversation and have a free account. I would encourage you to consider, the same way you would keep your phone by you, you can keep your Zoom on. It doesn't mean anybody's watching you, or if you're worried about it, put a piece of tape over the camera on your laptop. But you can answer a Zoom call the same way you can answer a call on your cell phone and have that personal interaction with an employee or with a customer. Get to know Zoom. There's a difference between an instant meeting, a scheduled meeting, and a webinar, which is what we're doing here. There's options for different levels of communication. Very, very flexible, very, very useful. Adobe, Adobe is offering, for anybody in the creative field who's already a Creative Cloud subscription holder, they're offering 2 to 3 months at no charge. If you've been wanting to subscribe to Adobe, any of the packages, they're offering up to 70% discounts for new subscriptions. HubSpot as a CRM is honestly something I've put off using for my business. I've been using this time to dive into it, and it's an excellent opportunity for documenting those conversations. Microsoft Teams is another one that's completely free. And if you can move some of your team communications out of email into accounts that your company owns, then you're owning those conversations, and you're not losing the opportunity to not be able to collect them. So if you're running your team communications through HubSpot or through Microsoft Teams, we've been using Podio for years. That's a way of capturing what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and all those pieces that are inherently important to your organization. The other thing that I'm not sure everybody's comfortable with, and this is a really good time to do that, if you're not really, really proficient at using your cell phone as a hotspot, so you've got great internet connections, learn that now. Regardless of where you're working from, and I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks to the work from home policies. If you're working from home, typically your employees aren't going to have high-speed broadband. If they do have high-speed internet, they've got 2 kids playing games in the background, and I've heard a lot of clients really bemoan the fact that they can't have good online conversations. That's where it comes back to learn to use your cell phone, especially if you've got unlimited data. You can get a really good connection online. I've run Zoom communications on my computer through my cell phone very reliably, and Verizon in particular, I know, is nowhere close to their capacity on bandwidth. So just a few tips and tricks to kind of navigate some of this. But again, as Sharon said, people are going to be asking, your employees are going to be asking about this 2 months from now, a year from now. Use this time to figure out how you're going to handle these things. And with that, I'm going to open it up. Do we have any questions, anything else that, that we haven't answered? Feel free to type it in the chat. I think all of the panelists are on audio. They can jump in. What else do we need to say yet? Well, that's a dead air time.
Hey,
Let's go back.
Karen,
Yeah.
while we're waiting, do you want to go back to some of the questions that people submitted in their registration?
Yep, let's do that. Let's make sure we haven't talked a lot about general concerns about client budgets. I know I touched on that a little bit, and I'm hearing, you know, it's especially for marketing, those budgets are going away. What are the rest of you hearing?
Yeah, I think people are definitely trying to figure out what is most essential for their budgets, especially as they're trying to figure out, you know, none of us know how long this is going to last. You know, so to the extent that you can make your services seem essential, obviously that's going to be beneficial. Of course, that's easier said than done. Also to the extent that you can work with people, like even with my general counsel clients, you know, I just reached out to everyone and said, hey guys, I'm going to throw an extra 2 months on the end of all your contracts pro bono, just because you're sticking with me right now. You're some of my best clients, and I want to help you and make sure you get through this. So anything that you can do like that, not as a PR stunt, right, but because it is genuinely the right thing to do as a decent human being, I think it's helpful. But now is definitely the time to start considering, how do you make payment terms? How do you offer some extended payment terms to your clients? And how do you position your services as essential?
Team morale. Sharon, do you want to talk to that? How do we keep up team morale? And I know you touched a little bit on some accountability issues as well. What's that looking like for those of us who don't have face-to-face with our employees?
So you brought up a couple of different solutions. We use Microsoft Teams internally, and so do several of my clients, and they are heavily dependent upon it right now to stay connected. They do it globally across the whole organization, but then they're breaking it down departmentally, and they're encouraging things like a daily touch point, even if it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you know, call in, tell me what you're doing, tell me how you're feeling. I think this is not the time for everybody to go into themselves and to just hunker down and focus. I think this is actually the time to invest a little bit more into outreach with one another and coming up with creative ways, doing virtual happy hours, whatever the case may be. The beautiful thing about a virtual happy hour, by the way, everybody's already at home. You don't even have to worry about driving. But, you know, things like that. So look at creative ways, be a little bit goofy. So many business owners frequently are afraid to show a fun side or afraid to show a softer side. for fear that they may lose the respect of their employees. Send out goofy memes. Do something that really lets the team know you're thinking about them. The mail still works, shipping still works. Send everybody a bag of coffee at home. Do things again that demonstrate that you're showing that you're thinking about them. But again, invest in that training. Even if you do low to no cost training where you get together once a week for a virtual lunch hour and discuss an article or discuss a business topic or discuss a client. The other thing that you can use this time for, and your team can do it too, because most likely members of your team work more so with one client than others, is use this to encourage your team to reach out, not to bill your clients, but to reach out and touch base with your clients and ask them questions, ask how they're doing. Building those, I see your question, Mindy, and I'll hop over to that here in a second. Building those relationships with clients too. Those are all really good things that keep your team engaged and make your team feel like they're doing something important as well. So free training resources. Not free, but Fred Pryor is offering their passport program super cheap right now. So check into that. And that is almost unlimited training year round. And you could use this time right now to build development programs and training programs. Also look at, if you're familiar with, it's now LinkedIn Learning. It used to be called what? Lynda.com. Yeah. So Metropolitan Library now, Westerville Library, all the libraries are working with LinkedIn Learning, formerly lynda.com, that if you have a library card, you can access their database for no additional cost. Talk about a really good way to build training for your team. So again, if you're keeping them on payroll, have them do things, not just sitting at home watching the daily 2 o'clock wine with DeWine hour. There are other things that people can be doing. And then also, if you have an EAP program, encourage people to use that resource because it comes with counseling services. If they are anxious, if they are stressed, you're paying for the resource, you're investing in the resource. Encourage your employees to utilize it because now's the time when they probably need it. And frequently on a lot of those EAP programs, there is a website full of resources that employees can just log into and read. So again, this is a great opportunity for you to find those resources, direct employees to them, encourage them to use the counseling services. And, so there are options out there that you can be creative with and create learning and training opportunities.
I'm going to tag team on that with, back to my Zoom soapbox. I've found Zoom to be very useful in one-on-one coaching and training with my team. So, in the everyday normal hubbub, sometimes it's hard to take time to spend and do the training with your team that you need to. You can jump on Zoom and record it. And I've done that a couple of different ways. Is you get on and do a one-on-one screen share. So you're looking at the screen together and talking through it. But I've also had situations where I've used the free version of Zoom and recorded what I'm doing and just basically talked to my computer and then saved that so that my team can reference that whenever they want to. So some of these things, these tools that we think of in one way can actually be awesome training resources in other ways too. We did talk a little bit about new expectations when the employees come back to work. Do either of you have anything you want to add on that? We've got, what about continuing to deliver my services?
I will hop in on the new expectations when employees come back to work. I think, again, we have to be prepared to talk about working differently. I think that's going to become really what happens toward the end of 2020 and into 2021, not only from a legal perspective, but in so many different ways. We have burst through so many barriers in the past month. unintentionally and intentionally. So I think as employers, we're going to have to be creative on how work happens going forward. I think bringing our employees back, we're going to have to do it with a certain level of empathy. And I also think we need to understand just because an order is lifted for us to come back to work does not mean this virus is gone. Keep in mind, all of these laws right now go until December 31st, 2020. They could be extended depending on how we control this virus. So I think we also have to continue to keep our fingers on the pulse of that and be prepared to work with that illness with our own people as well as their extended families and the awareness of all that. And I'll shut up now for Maritza.
Well, I'm going to jump in if Maritza's not going to and say, look at the flip side of this coin. This is a good opportunity to really look at how your team does like to work. We're assuming people are going to demand to work more from home, but I think this is also showing us that there's a huge portion of the workforce that really thrives on a group environment and thrives on human interaction. And that's going to need to be addressed just as much as the continued desire to work from home.
I think that's a fair point. I'm not a people-y person, but a lot of people are. So I do think you need to understand your teams and understand what the business really needs in order to function effectively, not what our individual, maybe sometimes outdated preferences are.
And those people, especially right now, need more conversation, more interaction than ever. Did you want to jump in, Maritza?
I was trying to. Sorry, I think my internet connection was getting a little fuzzy on me. I think that's absolutely right. I think even those of us self-professed introverts are a little bit anxious to kind of get back out there. But I've even seen, on the flip side of all of this is discussions about employees wanting to prove their value right now and prove just how much a part of the team they are and that they are good, productive members who shouldn't be subject to some of the layoffs that I think people are afraid are still going to come. So I think this is also a good opportunity to kind of look at your best performers and figure out, what does that end of year bonus or Christmas gift look like for those people that are able to stick with you and survive the crazy times that we're in right now? And how do you want to reward those top performers going forward?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things to do right now. We're all running scared, but you've just made the point that we really have to think about what's going to happen as soon as we see a change in the tide here. And that's going to come, as unprepared as we were for the pandemic, I wonder how unprepared we're going to be for the after effects. Either of you have comments you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm not even sure where to start on that one. We've talked a lot about the legal after effects that I think are going to pop up, but even just the after effects of, what does work look like going forward? To what extent are people going to want to work a traditional 9 to 5 after this? And how much are people going to want to be able to take breaks more frequently or, cut out in the middle of the day to go spend some time with their kids? Or take up a new hobby and a new interest. We talked about learning new things. I think this is also an incredibly great time. Spend some time doing something outside of work, find a new hobby if you can. Spend more time in a hobby that you've, put on the back burner that you need to go dust off. There are a lot of great resources out for those things as well. So, I'm really curious to see what the new work-life balance looks like after this.
I think that's a fair point, and I think a little tongue-in-cheek because we spend a lot of time prior to all this happening talking about the dreaded millennials, but I think really the millennials just won, even if they don't realize that they did. And the reason I'm saying that is I remember walking into a marketing company, Karen, it wasn't your company, but it was a marketing company, and seeing how they worked, and they were forcing what I call chunk working. They'd come in for a couple hours of work, go take an extended lunch, come back in for a couple hours of work, take dinner with their friends or go pick up a game of basketball and work in the evenings. And I get that work style. That's how I work, but it's really evident in that group because of their need for community and some of the other ways that they were living. And I think they essentially are going to win that battle simply by what's happened as a result of this virus. So like we've said, I think the biggest thing every employer needs to walk away from all of this with is, okay, I can't put the genie back into the bottle. So what do I need to do at this point to move forward? And maybe it's time that I look inside and see what my own biases are to how work is done, and figure out how work can be done better and more effectively for the team that I have. Having said that, the HR person comes out in me, and you still have to be compliant with the law, which is generally about 10 years behind where the rest of us are functioning. So you've got to bridge those two worlds, but there are ways that you can work differently, and I think we're going to be forced to look at that.
I think that's a good place to end this. No time like the present to spend the time and do that, to think through those things. And I think I can speak for all three of us. We are here for those conversations. I am going to try to continue doing additional virtual office hours. I would like to do some more of these webinars and bring some of the expertise in. Some of you know that we've been doing the Business Builder Breakfast for the past year. And that's one of the things that's not going to work anymore. So how can we move those online? But to continue those conversations. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm actually offering free consultations as needed, and just to help work through some of these things. My team has worked remotely quite a bit, and so I think we're a little more comfortable with some of the remote working. Sharon, I know you as well have.
Yep.
So and yeah, just give us one last thought, and we'll wrap up for today and make this.
My one last thought is you talked about putting up a FAST website. We put up a FAST web page. It is full of COVID related resources from an HR perspective at my website. So go-hr.biz. When you log in, you can't miss it. It's on the front page and it'll take you to a link. We're updating it almost daily. Please feel free to go there, download whatever you need. And if you have questions, y'all know how to get a hold of me. And take care of yourselves and be safe.
And we'll end how we started, Maritza.
Hey, well, same thing. We're trying to keep our COVID-19 information on our website, so msnlawoffice.com, and trying to get that information out to clients just so that you have a source that you can stay informed. But, I'll end on a positive note for a change. I firmly believe that we will get through this. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. That's why they're pushing so much aid out our direction. We will get through this. We will come back stronger. We just got to find a way to get through in the meantime. So if you're a person of faith, have faith. The rest of you, do whatever it is that you normally do to get through these types of crises, but we will get through this. All of our businesses are going to come back better and stronger than ever.
And that's where the virtual happy hours come in.
Amen.
You let us know when you schedule those, Sharon. Okay, thanks everybody, and don't hesitate to reach out with more questions.
Thank you.